Who wants to start us off? Yes, sir.
What are your top one or two bills that you sponsored that you're most proud of?
Sure. What's your name?
Austin.
Austin. So, I'll tell you the one bill that I'm probably most proud of that may not be the biggest thing I ever did. But I had the privilege, because I represented Maryland, and my district started right outside of Washington, D.C., and went all the way to Western Maryland. I had the privilege of representing a lot of veterans, because a lot of men and women who serve our country, they end up staying in the kind of the mid-Atlantic, greater DC region after their service is over. So I think my district had one of the highest percentage of veterans of any district. And so I did a lot of work on veterans issues. And this one issue I came upon, which was really disturbing to me, was we had this situation where our servicemen and women would come back and need specialty medical care in a VA hospital or in some other kind of specialty hospital because of an injury they incurred while in service. And while they were getting service, and they would be stationed all over the country depending upon where the right facility was for them, their family members would want to come and see them. Because remember, a lot of these people are incredibly young, right? Incredibly young. And their family members, their parents, would want to come and see them. But a lot of the families couldn't afford it. So they'd actually travel to visit their son or daughter who was getting taken care of or having surgery, amputees, all this kind of stuff. And they would literally camp out in tents on the property of the VA hospitals. So I led this effort to fund this program called the Fisher House program, where we actually built housing near VA hospitals, temporary housing, where family members could come and stay while their family member, typically their son and daughter, was receiving medical care. And it was just a very rewarding thing because of what I saw when I would go out and see these families. So that's probably one of the bills that I was most actually proud of, because I really feel like that's something that will endure for a long time, because this Fisher House program is going to grow and grow and grow, and we're going to keep getting more and more funding. In terms of something that I'm really proud of that was big, it didn't actually get done, but I think I changed the conversation on, was an infrastructure proposal I had. So I put together a proposal to fund $1 trillion of infrastructure in our country, which is something that we desperately need. In many ways, it's the most important thing for us to do. It's the simplest thing we can do to actually make a difference in so many Americans' lives. There was $1 trillion, which I actually think we need $2 trillion of infrastructure, but this was $1 trillion of funding. And it was fully paid for by fixing the international tax system. Prior to this last tax reform bill, we had a dynamic where all these big US companies were keeping their cash overseas. And it was a missed opportunity because we weren't collecting any tax revenue on that money, and they weren't bringing it back to invest in our country because of some weirdness in our international tax system. So I put together this plan to fix that international tax system, allow that money to come back to the United States, and it generated a lot of money for the Treasury, a lot of tax dollars. And I used that money to pay for $1 trillion infrastructure program. And it received tremendous bipartisan support. I had 40 Democrats in the House and 40 Republicans in the House. And I had a dozen Democratic senators and a dozen Republican senators. I was the head of the Freedom Caucus, which is the most conservative caucus in the House. And the guy who was the head at the time was this guy, Jim Jordan, who's on TV all the time now. I had him, and I had the head of the Progressive Caucus, which is the most liberal caucus in the House. So when you can get Jim Jordan and the head of the Progressive Caucus to agree on $1 trillion infrastructure proposal, you know you've found a sweet spot. And it would have passed if it ever got a vote. It never got a vote, unfortunately. And the reason it didn't get a vote is when they were doing the tax reform bill that passed 2 years ago now, they wanted to use the international tax fix that I came up with. They wanted to use that to further cut corporate tax rates as opposed to use the money for infrastructure. So that was a real missed opportunity, but I proved there is, in fact, a bipartisan coalition that can be built around infrastructure, which I think is an incredibly important thing for us to do. Yes, sir.
What's your approach to trade issues, trade imbalance, tariffs, subsidies,
Sure.
or free trade?
Well, so what's your name?
Tony.
Tony. So I'm the only Democrat running for president who supports something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which, as you probably know, Tony, because it sounds like you follow these issues. To some degree.
Yeah, I've been there.
You've been there. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a trade agreement that President Obama's administration negotiated. One of the key players in that negotiation, by the way, was your former governor, Tom Vilsack, who was the Secretary of Agriculture during the TPP negotiation, and he was fabulous at representing agriculture. So I was Obama's point person in the House on the TPP. I thought it was a great deal. You know, it was the best-in-class trade deal we've ever done around labor and environmental standards. It put the United States at the head of a 12-nation bloc of our allies. And collectively, we would have represented 40% of the global economy. It would have been the best way for us to compete successfully with China, because you have to compete with China, and you have to compete with China in Asia. And that's what this agreement was about. And it was incredibly good for the U.S. agriculture industry. And I think it was good in general for the U.S. economy. I thought it was a huge missed opportunity. And you know, one of the things I say to rural Iowa is, if I'm president, one of the first things I'm going to do is get us back in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I believe will make every acre of farmland in Iowa more valuable, literally overnight. So that probably gives you a sense as to how I feel about this issue. Now, I'm not saying tariffs, you know, don't have some role in changing behavior. We need to deal with China, but the main issue with China is not, in my opinion, the trade deficit. I'm not saying the trade deficit is a good thing, but it's not the central challenge with China. The central challenge with China, in my opinion, is intellectual property theft. And in many ways, and in many ways, it's really simple. I don't want to get into a Cold War with China, but this is how we have to think about China. They're pirates. They steal everything. Right? They steal intellectual property. They're stealing islands in the South China Sea. They just steal everything. And the only way to combat that is with our allies. Right? We have to get all of our allies on the same page, and we have to go to China as a unified front, and we have to be competing with them. And I thought the Trans-Pacific Partnership accomplished all of those objectives. It created a way for us to work with our allies. I'm a big believer in our allies. I think the post-World War II model of US diplomacy, which is basically could be summarized by working with allies to try to do things around the world that'll make the world more peaceful and secure. It's not perfect, we've made mistakes, but I actually believe in that model. I think the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a way for us to reassert ties with our allies, economic ties, which is the best way to work with people. It allowed us to compete with China. It was good for a lot of domestic industries, including agriculture. And it was, I think, critical to our foreign policy. So, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
Hopefully satisfactory. Yes, sir.
What's your position on Citizens United?
We should overturn it. So, I thought it was a bad ruling. I mean, the premise of Citizens United is that corporations are people too, and they should have the same rights in our democracy. You know, if you walk around Arlington Cemetery and you look at all those graves, in my opinion, those people didn't die for a bunch of corporations. And listen, I'm a capitalist, but I just think corporations shouldn't have the same rights as people do as it relates to our democracy. But in many ways, that decision gave them more rights. And let me explain to you what I mean. If someone were to give me money for my campaign, the most amount of money they can give me is $2,800. That's the cap. And if they give me more than $200, they have to say their name, their address, and what they do for a living. So in other words, you can look up online everyone who's given me money, and you can see where they live and what they do for a living. And you know that they can only give me $2,800. Now, under Citizens United, someone can set up a super PAC, and a corporation could put $100 million in it, and they don't have to say who they are. It can be completely dark and hidden. To me, that's not right. So what I would love to do is have the Citizens United decision overturned. I don't think that's going to happen with the current Supreme Court. What I would love to do is pass a constitutional amendment overturning Citizens United, and I'll commit to that. But again, I like to be honest with people. I wouldn't hold your breath on that. Like the Equal Rights Amendment, which simply says women are equal to men in every respect, that hasn't passed. There's no argument against the Equal Rights Amendment. I've never met anyone who could argue why we shouldn't pass the Equal Rights Amendment. And that still hasn't passed as an amendment to our Constitution. And I'd rather, by the way, pass that before even overturning Citizens United. But what I will do, because this is actually easy to do, is we can pass a law right now in the Congress that says as follows. Corporations can set up super PACs, go for it. But they can be limited at $2,800, and you have to disclose if you put money in. So in other words, I want to put corporations on the same footing as people as it relates to this issue day one. So that's my feedback. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the failing education system in the country. As president, what would you do to combat that and help lower income families and children in education?
Yeah. What's your name?
Katie.
Katie. So I'll tell you what I'd like to do. So I'd like to see public education reimagined in one very big important way. So right now, if you live in the United States of America, you're entitled to K through 12 public education. Some states have pre-K. You have it here, but not every state does. K through 12 is what you're entitled to as a citizen of this country. When I'm done being president, I'd like it to be pre-K through 14. So I think every kid in this country should have pre-K as a basic right of citizenship. Because if you look at the data, pre-K is one of the best investments we make. The kids who get pre-K do so much better than the kids who don't. And I think every kid should do that. And I also think kids need something after high school. That doesn't mean four-year college. But I think they should have access to community college or career and technical training. So to me, community college and career and technical training are, quote, 13 and 14. So I want pre-K through 14 to be the new K through 12 for every citizen in this country. I think it's good for them, I think it's good for all of us, and I think it'll grow our economy. I also want to expand early childhood education for poor kids. Because kids that are well off typically go to early childhood education. What that means is they get something when they're 2 or 3 years old. And if you look at the data, kids from stable economic families typically start kindergarten having heard 3 times the words that poor kids have heard. So just think about what it's like for a kid who's starting kindergarten. Imagine 2 little seats in a kindergarten class. One kid has heard 3 times the words as the other kid. It's not a surprise that their whole learning trajectories change. So I'm a big believer in early childhood education, universal pre-K, and skills training. I'm not a big believer in free 4-year college. And I'll tell you why I say that. It's not that I have anything against college. But A, we can't afford free 4-year college. And if we were to afford free 4-year college, we'd have no money for anything else. So if I had a couple $1 trillion to invest as your president in education, I would use some of it for early childhood. I'd use some of it to create universal pre-K. I'd use some of it to pay teachers better. I'd use some of it to get more technology in the classroom. I'd use some of it to create kind of community college and career and technical training for free. And then I'd use some of it to lower the rate on student loans. I wouldn't use all the money for free 4-year college. And that's just, I think, the choice someone's going to have to make. And that's how I think about that choice. I also think not everyone should go to college. I also think if we lower the rates on student loans and we have free community college, then someone can go to community college for 2 years, then finish somewhere else, have lower rates on their student loans, and would materially decrease the cost of college. So those are some of the things I want to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes?
So you talked about lowering the rate on student loans. Can you talk a little bit about your position on the current student loan debt?
So let's break it into 2 categories. For the kids that are coming up, I want to lower the rates on student loans. I want to do all the stuff I talked about. But let's talk about for the adults that have big student debts at this point. So I'd also want to create new programs that they could refinance their loans into at lower rates, and also have more of these income repayment programs. So in other words, you've got a student loan, you've got, I don't know, pick a number, $100,000 of student debt, and you get a new student loan for $100,000, but you don't have to pay a fixed payment, you have to pay a percentage of your income. So if you go work for Google in Silicon Valley, you're going to pay that loan off pretty quick. But if you become a journalist in rural Iowa, which is something we need more of, by the way, you're going to make basically very small payments every year, and who knows if you'll even ever pay it off. But your payment will be tied to a percentage of your income, so it's always going to be a manageable amount. So that's one big thing I would do. And I think that would lower payments a lot. And I'd also allow the kids or the adults with student debt to refinance into loans at lower rates, just like the kids getting out of high school. And then the final thing I would do, which seems like a small thing, but it shows the inequities in our student loan situation, is I would allow kids or adults who file for bankruptcy to have their student loans discharged in bankruptcy. So the only debt in the United States of America that is not dischargeable in bankruptcy is student debt. So if a corporation or an individual files for bankruptcy, any debt they have, if it's a corporation, any of their corporate debt, if they're an individual, their mortgage, their credit card debts, all that debt is dischargeable in bankruptcy, which is a fancy word for the judge being able to look at it and say, you know, unfortunately you're in bankruptcy, we want you to leave bankruptcy and have kind of a clean slate. So we're going to either write off those loans or we're going to reduce the balances. And a judge can do that through the power of the bankruptcy court. Except on student debts, the judge's hands are tied. We passed a law several decades ago saying a bankruptcy judge cannot write off student loans in bankruptcy, which to me is unbelievably unfair. No one wants to file for bankruptcy, but sometimes you're in that situation. And if you're going into bankruptcy because of your student debts, they ought to be dischargeable. So some things I do. Yes, sir.
About Sputnik, I was lucky enough to sit in the classroom and watch it on a black and white TV. How do you feel about term limits? I see some of the guys are talking about it, or some of the candidates. Is that a possibility, or is it even reality?
It's not a possibility. So again, one of the things I committed to myself when I entered public service, because I always had a lot of suspicion of politicians not telling me the truth, is I was going to tell everyone exactly what I believe. I'm totally for term limits. If I had my way, members of Congress would have 12-year term limits. So they could serve 6 terms in the House, 2 terms in the Senate. I think that'd be great. I kind of like the this citizen servant model, right? Which is you do something with your life, you do some service, and then maybe you go back and do something with your life again, right? And it's not your career. I love all that stuff. The problem is the Constitution does not put limits on these terms. And a bunch of states have tried to pass laws over the last several decades creating term limits. You know, so if the Iowa legislature passed a law today saying that members of the House and members of the Senate can only be in the US Congress for 12 years, if they pass that law in the Iowa legislature today, which some states have done across time, that would immediately be overturned as unconstitutional. Because the Constitution, which describes the office of Congress, right? The Constitution creates the Congress. It does not put limits on those terms. So therefore, any term limit done other than through a constitutional amendment is unconstitutional. So back to what I said to the gentleman earlier about Citizens United. If I'm president and a constitutional amendment comes to my desk overturning Citizens United, damn right I sign it. If an amendment comes to my desk having term limits, provided they're reasonable, I'm in for it. The Equal Rights Amendment, which I'm going to go fight for to try to get passed, because that's actually been pretty close. Like that's already in the hopper, and it's got a whole bunch. We amend the Constitution. It's not only the Congress, but the states have to approve it and all this stuff. But we're a long way. So yeah, I'm for it, but There's no way I can stand here and promise you I'm going to do that. So that's my view.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. What's your name?
Bridget,
Bridget.
so you mentioned unifying the country. What is your plan? What's your vision for how you will accomplish that?
So I think there's it's your words and your deeds. So I think a president's words are actually very important on this issue. And I think a president should wake up every day and have a quiet moment to themselves. Maybe it's in prayer, or maybe it's just in meditation, whatever it is. And somehow try to get strength to do something every single day to unify the country. Like that should be the defining, animating spirit of the President of the United States. Which doesn't mean from time to time a president's voice isn't needed to stand up against hate. Right? A president has to speak out against things that are wrong. But when they're not doing that, they should be unifying the country. So it's the way you talk about things and the way you act, and a certain dignity and respect you bring to the office of the presidency that I think we can unify. But then you have to have the deeds as well. And so let me tell you one of the things I want to do if I have the privilege of being the President of the United States. When I'm giving my inauguration speech, I want to tell the American people that I represent every one of them, whether they voted for me or not. And to prove it, in my first 100 days, which I think sets the whole tone of an administration, what I want to do is put my efforts behind 5 big ideas in infrastructure, in digital privacy, in healthcare and immigration. But every one of the proposals that I put forth will be based on an existing bipartisan bill in the Congress. We won't even change a word of them. Because I want to look out at the American people and say that your representatives, good-minded Democrats and Republicans, have actually found common ground on these 5 ideas. And so let's all work together on these. Because we obviously, or at least most of us, agree with each other on these things, or they wouldn't have bipartisan support in the Congress. You rarely find something that has bipartisan support in the Congress that doesn't have overwhelming support with the American people. And I just think it would be amazing if a president in their first 100 days said, my agenda is going to be 5 things where I know we have common ground. I think that'll change everything. I also think a president should debate the Congress every quarter. So I think the President of the United States should go every 3 months to the Congress of the United States on national television and stand there in front of the Congress and have a debate. You ever watch in the United Kingdom, they do this thing called Question Time with the Prime Minister?
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's a lot of theater. It's a little bit of the Wild West. But I kind of think it's the best part. The best part of politics is this stuff. Right, where someone has to stand up in front of you and answer questions, because you kind of figure out what they're all about in your own way. And I think if a president did that every quarter for a couple hours on national television, there'd be a lot of theater, there'd be all that stuff, but I think it would force everyone to be more honest. And I think the American people would start figuring out who's telling the truth, and I think that would be unifying. Any priority anyone in this room has would be crowded out. So that's the problem. One day interest rates will go up. None of us know when or why. Some people say this time is different, it won't happen. Always run away from people who say this time is different. Because everything goes back to the trend line, in my opinion at least. I mean, you are in the risk business, right? People will say when there's not a lot of risk in something, they'll say, well, this time is different. Guess what? Boom, next year. It always goes back to the trend line, right? And this will too. So let me tell you how I think about it. The problem we have in politics on this issue is it's a really bad debate. So you got some people who say it doesn't matter. Like it just doesn't matter. So for the reasons I just said, I don't agree with that. And then there are other people who say things like the deficit should be 0. You know, the government shouldn't spend more than it takes in, like American families. Well, that's also ridiculous policy. First of all, the federal government has rarely run at a zero deficit. And by the way, most American families don't run at zero. They borrow money for houses and all kinds of stuff. So, and if we never had debt in this country, this economy would be a lot smaller. So what I think we should have is we should have deficits at 2% a year. And I think if we have deficits at 2% a year, we're going to be just fine. And all my plans get us to 2% deficits. And the reason I think 2% deficits are fine is as follows. The only number that really matters is not how big the debt is. Because in 20 years, we'll look at $20 trillion debts and say, God, the debts were so small. What matters is the debt as a percentage of the economy. Right? Just like a mortgage, in someone having a $500,000 or $1 million mortgage doesn't matter in absolute terms. But when you compare it to the value of the house and what their income is, it matters. So what matters is our debt as a percentage of our economy. Historically, the debt in the United States of America has been about 60 to 70% of our economy. Now it's trending towards 100. The only time it was 100 before was World War II. And there was a damn good reason why we borrowed all that money. And by the way, we borrowed all that money from our citizens, which is not what we're doing now. But if we can grow our economy at 2.5% a year, which I believe with the right policies we can, if our economy grows at 2.5% a year and our deficits are 2% a year, then the debt as a percentage of our economy goes down a little bit every year, and we'll be just fine. So that's my view. Thank you very much.
First of all, a big thank you to you and your campaign. Thank you for making time. For all of you for participating, this is what makes our country work, and this is what's special about Nationwide. So talk it up. Let's have these things continue during this political season. And another big thank you to Congressman Delaney.